Hey, it's Nick here, and today we're going to be talking about every paper artist's worst enemy, cockling. So, first let's talk a little bit about paper. And so, paper is usually made from plant fibers, and lots of times, lots of really nice artist paper is made of cotton, which is very absorbent. And so, when those paper fibers come into contact with water, they can kind of absorb that water and they start to swell up and they become very soft and very malleable. Which is very helpful in the process of forming paper, and in the case of the intaglio artist, it is incredibly crucial to our craft. The swollen paper can get pressed into these tiny fine lines that are in this copper plate. Dampened surfaces are also very susceptible to ink, which makes them really nice if you want to use less ink. Your paper will pick up a lot more ink. Unfortunately for printmakers, and as well as watercolor artists and other people who work with paper, water distorts the surface of the paper when it dries. Whether you wet the whole thing or a little bit of the paper at once, it will never dry evenly, and so one part will dry before another, and it'll probably contract smaller than it was originally, at least for that area. So when the surrounding areas get their turn to contract, they have less material to work with, and so they'll try to pull the paper in their direction and even out, but it'll be unable to, and so it'll result in a somewhat of an uneven drying. And so there's a lot of ways to try and combat this. For watercolor artists, people often recommend taping the edges of your paper to a board or stapling the edges to a board, and that way your paper expands, but when it tries to contract, it's physically being held back by the staples or the tape. But in the case of tape, it doesn't work perfectly, and in the case of staples, it ends you with some unsightly holes around the edge. And sometimes you want to use the whole sheet of paper, and so this would be a better option to flatten it post-painting. So cockling is different from your run-of-the-mill just kind of distortion. Like if you had your paper rolled up in a tube and you try to roll it up flat and it's a little bit curled, that's different. You just kind of set a heavy weight on it and it'll go back to normal. Your paper is still dimensionally the same. With cockling, the moisture has physically kind of distorted and warped the dimensions of the paper. So if I tried to mount this watercolor to this board, like if I just put glue across the back and tried to shove it on there, it would still have some bubbles or wrinkles into it because it's dimensionally not uniform all the way through. So in order to frame this, I'm going to need to flatten it out, and in general, flattened paper is a lot easier to store. So in order to flatten it, we're going to need a few things. Firstly, a plastic bag, one big enough to fit your artwork. You could also use a trash bag. And then we're going to need some blotters. It's just some heavyweight, unsized paper, so it's very absorbent. And then you just need 4 pieces bigger than your artwork, but 6 is ideal. And then we're going to need 2 pieces of newsprint. We're going to dampen this, and if you want to use something more acid-free, because it's going to come in contact with your artwork, you can use 2 more sheets of blotter paper. And then you're going to need a spray bottle full of water. I like the Zep water bottle because it has a pretty big spray, and it gets you some pretty fine particles. And then you're just going to need some sort of board, or a heavy board ideally, or a board with a weight. So the plan is to re-dampen our work of art, and then we're going to dry it between the blotters and under weight, and so it will dry nice and uniformly. So we're going to take our newsprint and we're going to dampen newsprint rather than dampening our artwork. The goal is to re-dampen the artwork, but we want to use the absolute bare minimum amount of moisture in order to do this. The more moisture we put into our artwork, the longer it's going to take to dry, and if we send too much water into our blotter papers, they'll also begin to cockle. And so I'm going to spray each sheet of newsprint with enough water that the entire piece of newsprint turns translucent. And then I'm going to put it into the plastic bag so that moisture can equalize, and so I don't have any super damp spots of unequal moisture. And we're going to let that sit in there for about 10 minutes. And if you're using blotters to dampen your artwork, you're going to want to spray both sides of it rather heavily because blotter is super absorbent, and so where you spray it, your water is more likely to kind of stay in that area rather than spreading out. But avoid soaking it too much because when blotters get super wet, they tend to fall apart because they don't have any sizing and they're very loosely pulled. One of the things we're going to have to pay attention to is the sound of our artwork. So listen to the crinkle of completely dry paper. When the paper is thoroughly dampened, it should be very quiet and it won't really make any noise. Now we're going to take our artwork And we're going to put it in between those two pieces of newsprint that we dampened earlier. And it's going to transfer over a really nice even layer of moisture to the artwork. And by using the absolute bare minimum of moisture, we'll probably have this artwork out and flattened probably within the next 20 to 30 minutes, as opposed to if you just sprayed the back of the artwork. I've even seen people use a sponge to redampen the back of their artwork. And methods like those, people usually spend anywhere between 8 hours to, I've even seen weeks for them to try and flatten their artwork nice and dry. So again, I want to emphasize that we want the absolute bare minimum of moisture within our piece. And so I'm going to check up on my artwork about every minute and a half or so, and I'm going to give it a little wiggle to see if it's gone silent or not. So it's quieter, but it's not quite dead silent. So I'm going to stick it back into the bag and check up on it in a little bit. Now this is the gentle sound that I've been waiting for, and it only took about 3 minutes this time. I'd do this up to about a maximum of 5 minutes, and if it was still making noise, I'd probably go ahead with the drying process anyway. And from here, simply, we're just going to sandwich our artwork between two blotters, and then put the heavy board on top of it. And we're going to let this sit for about 5 minutes. And the blotters are going to absorb a lot of the moisture out of the artwork, but eventually they're going to reach a sort of equilibrium point where the blotters don't really want to pull any more moisture from the artwork. And as I mentioned earlier, if the blotters absorb too much moisture, they'll also begin to cockle. And so after the 5-minute mark, we're going to swap out these blotters for some nice fresh dry blotters, and we're going to set our old blotters out to dry so they can release their own moisture. And letting the blotters dry and not absorb too much moisture really goes a long way in their longevity, and you want to keep your blotters nice and flat. Yes, you could push them for 10 minutes at a time, but then your blotters are going to start to warp, and then eventually they'll become unusable if they're too warped themselves. And so after 5 minutes, let's take a quick look, and it's looking a lot straighter already, nice and flat. That's a lot of progress in just 5 minutes. But when I put my hand to it, it has a little bit of a cold feeling to it. That cold feeling still means that there's moisture in there, and you want it to be as kind of warm as a dry blotter sheet is going to be. And so we're going to swap out these blotters for some fresh blotters and put it in here for another 5 minutes. And so after our 5 minutes are up, let's take another peek at it. It's looking quite flat and it's feeling a lot more warm, but it's not as warm as a dry sheet of paper. So this is where a third set of blotters would come in handy, and you're going to start drying it again. If not, switch back to the first set of blotters, which are hopefully a lot more dry now. Don't be deceived, you think it's really flat, but if there's even just a little bit of moisture still left in this paper, it's going to start to curl and cockle again. It'll be flatter than it was before, but it won't be perfectly flat. So now after 10 minutes, let's take another peek at it, and it is indeed very flat, and it feels as warm as a dry blotter sheet. So now I can leave this out and it's completely done. I don't have to do anything else to it. And so this is good for removing cockling out of paper, but if we go back to our intaglio example, because we didn't use any mechanical pressure and we didn't restretch the paper, we only undid what was done by the water, you can see that the deboss mark in the paper is still here. And that's pretty much all there is to it. That's the fastest way that I know how to flatten a sheet of paper, good, flat, and stable. Another thing that you can do, if you have some sort of hot plate, or you could stick your blotters in the oven for about 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and you press it between heated blotters, you'll cut the time in half, and so you'll probably be done after the first 10 minutes. Now, if you're looking for a less labor-intensive method, I have a few alternatives. If you're fortunate enough, you can set up a compression dryer, which comprises of a sheet of corrugated board, and make sure that all the flutes travel in the same direction. Some synthetic felts, you can get the nice ones from here, Carriage House Papers, or I use these Pellon heavyweight felts. And then sheets of blotter paper, and then you can stick your dampened artwork into the sandwich, and then top it off with another blotter, a felt, another piece of corrugated board with the flutes going in the same direction as the first one, and then your heavy board on top. And then you can drop a fan to push air through the flutes of the corrugation, and what this is going to do is allow that moisture that was in your print to get wicked up into the blotters which gets wicked into the felt, which gets wicked into the corrugated board, and the fan's going to push air to take that moisture out and back into the atmosphere. And you'll have your print done in probably about 4 to 8 hours. But with this method, you can keep stacking sandwiches and just kind of set it and forget it. And lastly, if you've got some spare sheetrock lying around, you can use those. And so you can cover it with a nice cleaner sheet of paper. In particular, this sheetrock was from when we were renovating the bathroom, so it's a mold resistant one. But in general, this process doesn't really impart that much moisture into it that it would get moldy. And so after you've placed your dampened prints into here, just set it for about 8 hours, check on it, and it should be done after a while. The important thing with this method is to make sure that you separate your drywall sheets afterwards, and that way they can release the moisture that they've absorbed back into the air and they'll be dry again. Otherwise, they're just going to keep soaking and eventually reach some sort of saturation point where they won't want to absorb any more moisture. So that's all I've got for this video. If I helped you out, please leave a like, and I'll see you next week. Oh, I almost forgot. Don't forget to take the newsprint out of that plastic bag and turn your plastic bag inside out to get all the moisture out. Otherwise, after about 3 days, you'll probably start growing mold in that plastic bag. See ya.